Welcome back. Now, during the recent IMO MEPC 83 negotiations, a coalition of African nations and Pacific Island states abstained from endorsing a global shipping emissions agreement. The decision underscores concerns about the agreement's inadequacy in addressing the pressing challenges of the climate crisis, signaling a united call for stronger and more equitable climate action within the maritime sector. Now, joining us on Zoom are Dr. Dola Oluteye, an expert in environmental design and marine infrastructure, as well as Eldine Chilembo Glees, a specialist in marine policy and sustainable shipping. Ladies, good evening, and thank you so much for joining us this evening here on the Daily Roundup.
Thank you for having me.
Well, to start with, Dr. Dola, I'll start with you. Perhaps you can talk to us about, some of these specific shortcomings, in the global shipping emissions agreement that led African nations and the Pacific Island states to abstain from supporting, it during the IMO MEPC 83 negotiations.
Yes, I wouldn't say that most of the African nations abstained. I think there were some rules, and there were some rules that excluded some African countries from even voting. But for those that abstained, there are many dynamics to it. I won't speak too much to them, but in just focusing on the main shortcomings, I will highlight 3 to 4 main things. Firstly, this particular policy architecture that's been passed now promises insufficient emissions reductions. So the agreed measures are projected to now deliver 10% reductions by 2030, which is far below the IMO's own target of at least 20%, striving for 30%. Secondly, also, it's a sort of weak carbon pricing structure. So the levy applies only to a portion of emissions and not all, and this weakens its impact. Thirdly, we have this unclear revenue allocation as well. So whilst the framework mentions a just and equitable transition, the actual funding levels are insufficient to cover both rewards for clean fuels, because we need clean fuels, or zero and near zero emissions fuels in shipping, and also a meaningful support for developing countries because of the impact. And I'll just speak finally to high transition risks for developing countries. So countries with poor access to capital face the risk of being left behind. And I don't know if your listeners, viewers are familiar with the term just and equitable transition that leaves no one behind. What we have right now promises or indicates that some countries will be left behind with no guarantee of adequate support under the current structure.
Madam Glees, how does the failure to include a robust, carbon pricing mechanism in the adopted agreement impact climate vulnerable nations? And what alternative approaches could address these challenges?
Thank you, Nina. To what Dr. Dola was saying, the Pacific and their allies, including the Seychelles, the Caribbean, some African nations, Central American states, and also the UK, put forward a proposal for a universal levy on greenhouse gas emissions. And this proposal would have created a pathway to rapidly reducing shipping emissions, ensuring that the IMO meets its agreed targets, and provide predictable financing for those suffering the most from climate impact. And that's essentially what a just and equitable transition means here. So while this UN shipping, because it's a United Nations body, while this shipping agreement is a victory for multilateralism, it's actually a failure for climate action. The framework will see the IMO's own GHG reduction targets for 2030, for 2040, for 2050 missed by a very significant margin, just like Dr. Dola had explained. And so this current package will exempt nearly 90% of excess shipping emissions from carbon penalties via what we call a remedial unit. So these are essentially credits to allow polluting ships and polluting states to just continue polluting, right? So this will generate around 10 billion per year until 2035, instead of the 60 billion that it was predicted to generate in revenues. And how and when these will be distributed is heavily dependent on the creation of a net zero fund. What is clear, though, at present is that the funds are earmarked for industry use. So essentially, they will only be used most likely for biofuel production and not for vulnerable nations bearing the brunt of climate impacts. And what this signifies is that the IMO measures will be an open door for first generation biofuels to be produced from food and feed crops. And this will likely just lead to significant deforestation and also affect food prices, causing more food security concerns, and something that's very important to African nations. So to your question of what kind of other technologies we can use to address these challenges, wind propulsion technology is a great way to address this. And for African nations, because for African nations, biofuel will only increase food security issues. So then looking to how wind propulsion technology can reduce our reliance on fossil fuels should be a great solution to these current challenges.
Mm-hmm. Or also speak to us, Madam Glees, how does the proposed universal greenhouse gas levy aim to balance the principles of climate justice, financial predictability and emissions reductions? And why was it opposed by some major economies?
So, as I said, with the ACP, especially the African, Caribbean, and the Pacific nations, were basically very much proponents of, even the shipping industry itself was actually behind a global universal levy and a global fuel standard. And the reason why they wanted this was because if the IMO was very serious about achieving its targets, 30% by 2030, 80% by 2040, to reach net zero by 2050, the only way to do that was incentivizing the industry to move to alternative fuels. And to do that, you need to make alternative fuels competitive. And the only way you do that is putting an ambitious and high price on fossil fuel use so that you can quickly transition away from fossil fuels. And the reason this is significant, a lot of African nations have also realized how the fossil fuel industry is highly subsidized, and the people who bear the brunt of those subsidies are the most vulnerable communities within those countries. And that's why in 2022, Senegal actually phased out fossil fuel subsidies. Angola has agreed to phase out fossil fuel subsidies, as well as Kenya in 2025, because they realize that actually subsidizing the most climate inducing emissions is not really helping anybody in our communities. It's not helping our economic development. So unfortunately, due to external geopolitical pressures with the trade wars at the forefront, the IMO decided to settle for a watered-down proposal on the table. And then after 10 years, and this comes after 10 years of negotiations, which is personally disappointing to me, because many of the member states were just desperate for any agreement. And as many of them put it, they said, you know what, a better deal is probably better than no deal at all, which is not surprising because these comments come from the developing world, and they can actually afford to say that because they're the least impacted.
Thank you so much. Dr. Dola, speak to us about the role, what role do revenue sharing provisions play in ensuring that climate vulnerable nations have the resources to address climate impacts, and how might these provisions influence future negotiations?
Yeah, revenue sharing provisions, I think the most critical aspect of it is funding critical infrastructure and adaptation projects and capacity building, especially for developing countries, specifically low-income countries. So when we think about Africa, just as an example, Africa has 38 coastal countries. And whilst Africa's Africa doesn't necessarily have a lot of ships because their contribution to the global shipping port is very, very low. So when we think about the port infrastructure that Africa has, and thinking about ships having to move the technology to all these renewable fuels, the ports need to be ready. So we need enough funding to be able to upgrade the existing infrastructure. And whilst I mentioned ports, actually the most critical thing is the infrastructure to power ports and make sure that the African ports are green. So revenue sharing provisions are critical to regions like Africa because of the infrastructure, poverty that we have at the moment, and also adaptation projects and capacity development. We'll have seafarers. Seafarers would need to upskill. And also the essential nature of revenue sharing is also to avoid disproportionate impacts on economies that contribute the least to emissions but face the highest risk. The global contribution of Africa to emissions, I mean, globally, not even talking about shipping, is about 4%, but the impact is significant. And one of the most critical things that we need to really think about when we're focusing on Africa and also the climate vulnerable countries and regions is that their economies are not diversified. And this is why I really welcome the AFCFTA agreement, because we need to begin to think differently in Africa, trying to be self-sufficient. Today, I listened to the Prime Minister of Barbados talking about, things that the region need to start thinking about and doing to be able to absorb the shocks of all the geopolitical issues happening right now and all the trade wars that is going on, so that, at the end of the day, the people in these regions are going to bear the brunt of what is happening. And finally, also, we need to think about bridging gaps between ambition and capacity. And this is especially true also for Africa Seeds and LDCs. And to the latter part of your question, the inclusion or strengthening in future frameworks could become a non-negotiable demand for broad support. Why do we not ring fence elements of negotiations where they are actually non-negotiables? I think we need to think about that, especially at the UN level, because these countries do not have the economic power to negotiate with we can't even say contemporaries, even though they say it is equal. It's not a level playing field, and also push future negotiations to better reflect equity, loss and damage, and climate justice principles. We should not just be using terms like just an equitable transition that leaves no one behind, when at the end of the day, that will not show in what we are agreeing. And so I think from everything that I've said, the idea here is that revenue sharing is not just about giving money away. It's about trying to make sure that the playing field is leveled. And for regions like Africa and all the climate, islands, climate susceptible, regions like Pacific and Caribbean islands, we need to figure out how to balance this economic and climate negotiations in a way where we can all win. Because I can't say that with the passing of this regulation that's just gone out, this policy, that Africa has won or the Caribbean islands or Pacific have won. We need to figure out how the world can be a bit more equitable, even though it might not be equal.
Well, thank you so much. Well, ladies, unfortunately, we're out of time. And so, Eldine, I just want to ask you very briefly, perhaps you'd like to add on to what Dr. Dola said, or just briefly talk to us about some strategies that, African nations and, Pacific Island states can adopt to strengthen their influence.
Yes, and Dr. Dola prefaced this too. I think the most important is becoming an active participating member of the IMO. And to do that, you need to be a signatory to the MARPOL amendments. And as of 2023, only 26 African countries, including Namibia, Angola, and also most of the SADC countries, which is really good, have ratified MARPOL. And only countries who have had their financial contributions in good standing at the IMO were allowed to vote this time around. So that means it's not just enough to be a member. You need to have ratified MARPOL, which is where the discussions are going to be centered around. And then you need to be able to be to to be an active participant, because at the closing of the committee negotiations, the chairperson actually remarked on how this was the first international treaty that addressed food security. And this was a historic win that would not have been possible without the leadership of African delegates, because they insisted on an expert working group to assess how the strategy would affect food security and how those impacted should be mitigated. So that's a huge win for Africa and its least developed economies, and it's also a case study for why we should be in the room advocating for us.
Madam Eldine Chilembo Glees and Dr. Dola Oluteye, thank you so much for joining us this evening here on the Daily Roundup with Nina. We really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Also on that note, we wrap up today's edition of the Daily Roundup. We're back tomorrow evening, same time and place. From myself and the team is good night. Thank you so much for watching.